Well, good morning and welcome. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Roger. I am the teaching pastor here, as if you didn't know that. We're going to continue on a series we started off a few weeks ago. We got a couple more weeks of this before we jump into our next one. But let's just recap the series. So, the idea behind the series, am I on here? Okay. The idea behind the series is I have been hearing a lot, I've been having a lot of questions from individuals about the Bible. I hear this almost on a weekly basis. I saw this TikTok. I saw this reel. I heard on Facebook. Somebody said to me, somebody said on TV, somebody said while I was watching this movie. And you hear all this stuff going on. And what can happen is if you don't actually know, then what you can have this kind of biblical insecurity or Christian insecurity. And I think as Christians, we already are suffering from that in our culture. So the idea behind this series is to answer the most common questions I get asked in regards to this. So let's just recap what we talked about last week. So last week we asked this question: does science and the Bible conflict? It's a very, very common theme. So people will say, well, you can believe in God. I believe in the big spaghetti monster in the sky. And both of them equivalent to the same thing. People who are rational, yeah, I don't know what that word is. People who are rational and people who are scientific, well, they don't believe in God. So the idea simply is that they say, well, you know what? Because you are a Christian, you can believe in a myth or a fairy tale, but that's not the truth. I tried to show last week that even amongst Christians, there's different ways of approaching this, right? So when we look at the creation account, and this is usually where it starts off at, when you look at the creation account, Genesis chapter 1 and 2, people come to us and say, okay, what exactly is going on here? And we tried to talk about last week how there are three different worldviews that are kind of circulating in our culture. We talked about the Greek worldview, we talked about the Latin worldview, and we talked about the Hebrew worldview. And I said the problem with the Greek and the Latin worldview is not that it's a problem, but when you apply those two worldviews to the Bible, you're going to get the wrong answers. See, in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, the Jewish writer Moses was not interested in the mechanism of creation. He wasn't interested in the methodology of creation. He was interested in the creator. And he says, this is what it is. And for the Jewish writers, they go, okay, yeah, okay, great. And to the ancient world, they're like, yeah, great. We, Western Christians, empiricists, we come in and say, okay, no. And we talked about this last week, but like I've had very vigorous conversations with people who believe, no, God created the world in 6 days. Bible says 6 days, it's 6 days. Fantastic, have at it. Go in the other direction by logos, like no, God used evolution and evolutionary mechanisms to create everything. Fine, have at it. In the middle there is reason.org, and I just kind of tell you, I kind of more towards the middle there in the sense of that it wasn't 6 days, but it was actually more like 6 time periods. Because we talked about last week with the Hebrew word day doesn't actually mean 24 hours. Please understand something, and I just want to make sure I'm really, really clear on this. All three of these camps have very different ways of understanding creation and that, but all of them believe in a creator. And that's what's most important to me. Right? So, as Christians, we've gotten so tied to some things that are not salvific. Okay? Now, when I use the word salvific, I believe that there are some things, and we're going to talk about this next week actually, that there are some things that are immovable within Christianity. But I do believe as well, too, that there are some things that the Bible isn't explicit on. And on those things, we go, okay, grace, we can have grace on this. We can have a difference of opinion. Because all three of these have have the same starting point, different mechanisms, but still end up at Jesus and the cross. We go, okay, fair enough. I talked about last week as well, too, that when we talk about science, we talk about religion, these are the points where science and religion both agree on. Right? The universe has a starting point. There has been a progressive development of some aspects of creation. I said this last week, and I want to clarify something. When Darwin wrote Origin of the Species, he wasn't talking about macroevolution, he was talking about microevolution. And this has been recognized. This is not a controversial statement. When he talks about the beaks of the finches, that's microevolution. We know that species do have adaptation as a part of their mechanism. We recognize this. We see this. No problem. But when you extrapolate this to a larger part, that's where in biochemical engineers, that's where biologists, that's where physicists go, it doesn't quite fit. And I showed that video last week where even in those camps, there's a lot of fluctuation. And again, fair enough, right? Humans are a unique mammal in the universe. And again, it doesn't matter who you're talking to. human beings have a unique place in the creation account. Earth is a unique planet in the universe, and this is not even whenever you see on the news here, like, oh, we found water on this planet, we get so excited. Fantastic, you found water, but you're still a far way away from actually a species. And then finally, there are many elements of the universe science has not answered. Our beginning, human consciousness, and we're going to talk a little bit about this morning as well too, and the biochemical progression. And so when we talk about this idea, we use the story of Galileo, right? Galileo got in trouble with the Catholic Church, and he basically kind of reversed their way of understanding the universe. But again, the Catholic Church at that time, and please, I'm not picking on Catholics. It's just that they were the dominant religion at the time. The Catholic Church at that time had set a narrative that was incorrect, and they had anchored themselves to that narrative without any proof. And again, same thing, right? And Galileo comes around like, no, actually, it's not that at all. And then heresy, it's all that. And again, this is where we see a great example of the church and science coming in conflict where there needs to be no conflict. So, and then again, I reference Friedrich Nietzsche, and this is one of my favorite quotes. It is our preference that decides against Christianity, not arguments. And we're going to unpack that a little bit more, because this is probably, I really feel sorry for Nietzsche, because he gets a lot of flack for things he said, but people don't actually know what he actually said. So here's a little fun fact for you. Nietzsche never said God is dead. Although T-shirts and posts have said that, that's not what he said. The actual correct translation is, what happens when God dies? What do you replace God with? That's actually what he said. Existentialism isn't this idea of like, oh, there's no God. It's like, okay, where do we find meaning from? And by the way, that's a great conversation. I have no problem with that conversation. I do have a problem when people go, no, Nietzsche, I'm like, no, he didn't actually. And let's talk about the references you're using there, but that's not what he said. So that's what we talked about last week. This morning, we're going to jump off from there. We're going to kind of go, and we're going to go in a different way. But before we get to that, a guy named Clyde Rutledge had this great article in the New York Times. And the article was called, "Don't Believe in God? Maybe You'll Try UFOs." That's why it caught my attention. And this is what he says. Polls certainly indicate a decline in religious affiliation, practice, and belief. Just a couple of decades ago, about 95% of Americans reported belonging to a religious group. This number is now around 75. By the way, this article is a few years old. That's now down to 62%. And far fewer are actively religious. The percentage of regular churchgoers may be as low as 15 to 20%. Again, we're looking between 11 to 12%. Now, here's the important part, and this is actually kind of important. When you talk about people who are religious, people may identify as Christian. Remember I've said to you that the censuses and all that, they don't really convey proper information. So if someone says to me, I'm a Christian or I'm religious, I would like a drop-down menu. When's the last time you attended church? How often do you go? Are you actually engaged in a community? Now, I know that's terrible, but that's actually how I actually think a person can actually identify. And please understand, that goes across every religion. I've talked to many Sikhs, to many Muslims, to many other religious affiliations, and they're the same thing as well, too. Yeah, we celebrate Ramadan, we celebrate Eid, we do that, but we don't actually go to a mosque, we don't actually go to a temple. And for them, I would say, well, I don't think you are allowed to identify in this religious group. And they're like, yeah, my parents, what can I do, right? And that's fine. But likewise, when we talk about actively religious as opposed to self-identified, that's a very different conversation. And I think it's a very honest conversation and a very dishonest way of kind of looking at statistics. He goes on to say this. Nonetheless, there is reason to doubt the death of religion, or at least the death of what you might call the religious mind. Our concern with the existential questions and our search for meaning. A growing body of research suggests that the evidence for a decline in traditional religious belief, identity, and practice does not reflect a decline in this underlying spiritual inclination. This is very important, by the way. And this is not even controversial. We know that human beings, for some reason, and we can talk about that in a different conversation, but for some reason, human beings have this need for meaning. And what's interesting about human beings is we don't really find meaning within ourselves. Because when we look inside, if we're really honest, we don't like what we see. And we go, well, that's not meaning. But then when we look around us, we go, well, people aren't that much better either. So that's not really meaning as well, too. So we got to look somewhere else for meaning. Ask yourself, why are people religious to begin with? One view is that religion is an ancient way of understanding and organizing the world that persists largely because the societies pass it down from generation to generation. This view is related to the idea that the rise of science entails the fall of religion. It also assumes that the strength of religion is best measured by how much doctrine people accept and how observant they are. And again, I think he brings up a really valid point. So we've seen scientific breakthroughs all over the place for the last, let's just say, 100 years. However, according to the United Nations, 85% of the globe is still religious. Now, please recognize something. I didn't say Christian, I said religious, right? And again, religious inclinations have not disappeared at the advent of the rise of science. And he brings up a really great point. He goes on to this. Furthermore, evidence suggests that the religious mind persists even when we lose faith in traditional religious beliefs and institutions. Consider that roughly 30% of Americans report that they have felt in contact with somebody who's died. Nearly 20% believe they have been in the presence of a ghost. About one-third of Americans believe that ghosts can exist and can interact with and harm humans. Around two-thirds hold supernatural or paranormal beliefs of some kind, including beliefs in reincarnation, spirituality, energy, and psychic powers. See, what's interesting is that I've had many conversations with people who don't look at the Bible as being true or not would be religious. But then they'll say something like, well, my astrology or my this or the big term I'm hearing right now a lot is manifest. By the way, I hate this term, but I'm hearing it a lot, right? If I just manifest it. And again, I want to manifest chicken wings. It doesn't always happen, but I try. I got to confess to you, I do try. And through Uber Eats, I can. But the point is this, is that this is a big thing here. So people will make claims, but they're not really based upon science. Richard Dawkins, in a very famous debate, the debater pushed him to talk about the origin of the world. Because again, please understand, science has not figured out how the Big Bang began. So Richard Dawkins pushed and pushed and pushed because the guy was like, okay, listen, I understand you reject God, but you have to give me some explanation. Well, okay, no, there's no proof of that. So finally, pushed into the corner, Richard Dawkins said, well, maybe aliens came along and seeded this planet with the genetic materials by which to create it. Now, please, I accept that as his hypothesis, but again, no proof. That is an act of wild faith to make that statement. And he said it as if like, well, But it's like, okay, you're not really being honest to your own methods. And finally, finally. These numbers are much higher than they were in previous decades when more people reported being highly religious. People who do not frequently attend church are twice as likely to believe in ghosts as those who are regular churchgoers. The less religious people are, the more likely they are to endorse empirically unsupported ideas about UFOs, intelligent aliens, monitoring the lives of human beings, and related to conspiracies and a government cover-up of these phenomena. By the way, conspiracies, hello, we are already there. As emerging body of research supports the thesis that these interests in non-traditional, supernatural, and paranormal phenomena are driven by the same cognitive processes and motives that inspire religion. So what he's basically saying, and I think we can all agree on this, is that as we move towards a more secularized society, society is still grappling with answers. And again, I will say to you, science is not all the answers. I think that's pretty easy to say. So we find other things, right? So it was funny. Yesterday I was working, and I was I was putting on a screen protector on my phone. I know. And this woman who I was doing it for, this customer, goes, "Oh, you must be a Virgo, because only only a Virgo could be that much of attention to detail." I said, "Oh, that's interesting." I said, "Well, I'm not a Virgo. What would be your second guess?" She goes, "Well, She looked at me as if I don't know, and she's like, "Sagittarius. Must be a Sagittarius." I'm like, "Oh, okay." I'm like, "I have no idea what that means." She goes, "Now, tell me, how right am I? Which one are you, Sagittarius and Virgo?" I said, "Well, I'm actually neither." She's like, "Oh, okay." And she went through a list. I think she hit me at like number 6. I'm a Leo. Oh, Leo. Well, of course. No, yeah, that makes total. No, it doesn't. You're making this up. But the point is that, again, I don't know who this individual is. But the point is that we always look to something else to define who we are. And I think there's a funny fact within our society is that people say this stuff straight face, but when Christians talk about God, we're like, "Oh, you poor, poor simpleton," or something like that. When we talk about manifestation, we talk about energies and vibes and this and that. That's all accepted. But when I talk about God, it's like, well, you are just so simple. And that's kind of an interesting kind of take on it. So every week we have a verse of scripture that's going to kind of guide us through this. And for this morning, we're going to take a look at Psalm 78. And Psalm 78, chapter 2b to 4 says this: I will teach you hidden lessons from your past. Stories we have heard and known, stories our ancestors handed down to us. We will not hide these truths from our children. We will tell the next generation about the glorious deeds of the Lord, about his power and his mighty wonders. What I love about the Psalms is they're not just simply a song book of the Jewish people of the Israel nation, but they're also musings about how we talk about faith to, our this generation. And you can have the sense of like parents trying to tell their children, grandparents tell their grandkids, whatever it might be. You see this idea of like, okay, the worship of Yahweh isn't just for me, it's for everyone. And how do I explain this? How do I extrapolate it? Well, what I love about this passage of scripture is one of the things the writer is going to point to is Israel's history as a way of proving who God is. So I told you before, I mentioned this to you before, that when I was a teenager, I left the church. I was tired of the hypocrisy in the church because apparently I was so wise as a 16-year-old. I had great hair, but I don't know if I was wise, right? I just saw the hypocrisy in my church and said, well, Christianity cannot be true, therefore I'm going to go find truth in the world. I came back to Christianity, obviously, but the point is this, though. I asked a lot of different questions. I asked a lot of hard questions about Christianity. And I recognized something really important, even in my younger days, was this. The hypocrisy I saw was not God's fault. And if I was really being honest, I'm part of that hypocrisy. Okay. But then, is the Bible true? So I started asking myself questions about, like, how do we look at it? So some arguments that persuaded me, one of them is the cosmological argument. Now, we've talked a little bit about this. I'm not going to unpack it. But basically, we looked at this last week when I showed you Nobel Prize winners in different disciplines who all say, yes, I believe in God. Now, I said to you last week that Nobel Prize is considered the highest achievement in the scientific field. Right? They don't give the Nobel Prize winners Nobel Prizes out to, just whoever. Right? These are for the highest achievements. And what's interesting is I showed you a list. And by the way, I showed you an abbreviated list. But Nobel Prize winners and the cosmological argument for the beginnings of the universe is, for me, a very key piece for me to believe in God. Because there's so much there, so much order. We haven't talked about the weak and strong nuclear forces. We haven't talked about all that there. But there's so much in this that's just like, you know what? It's too exact. It's just too exact for it just to be random. So I said to you that cosmological, right? There's also two other ones as well, too. One of them is anthropological. Now, this seems kind of weird, but let me explain something to you. Throughout history, every culture we've encountered is religious. That tells me something. Because if macroevolution is true, we should have people groups around the world who develop and grow with no understanding of God. Just say, you know what? It's just the world and that's all there is to it. Right? We've never found a tribe of atheists, in other words. But what we have found are rich religious structures within ancient cultures. And again, you go, well, those are just ancient people. They're simple. Well, again, it still persists to us today with all the advent of information. Another one I think is really important is, and we didn't talk about this so much, is human consciousness. What's interesting about human consciousness is this still defies definition. Because we know that other species, other mammals, other creatures on this planet have brains. But somehow, some way, human beings made this leap from whatever the animal kingdom brain is to a self-aware brain, consciousness. And just so you know, this for me is really important because why would we as a species, as a mammal, why would we be the one to kind of jump into this? Right? Why would we be the one to have consciousness when every other species doesn't have it? And the last one is historical, and that's where we're going to go today. Let me unpack this for you. A guy by the name of Robert Funk did something a couple of decades ago called the Jesus Seminar. Robert Funk brought all these individuals together and say, okay, let's take a look at the Bible, and let's actually see what's true in the Bible and what's not. And they had these colored beads that they would use to kind of say, hey, this is true or this is not true. By the way, the Jesus seminars got a lot of media attention, but what people didn't do was actually examine the credentials of the people who were making these determinations. One guy on the Jesus seminars was a guy named Paul Verhoeven. Not Dr. Paul Verhoeven, for Paul Verhoeven. You may not know him, but you may know some of his movies. One was called Showgirls. I know. You're like, well, that's so silly. Of course it is, but this whole thing was silly anyways. But people, like the media says, Jesus seminars declare that, 70% of the New Testament is not written by the writers. And the headlines grab that, but nobody actually asked the question, well, what was your determination? So how they would do it is they would read a verse, and everybody would judge. And they would have these colored beads like, yes, definitely, and no, definitely not. One of the criteria, if it was supernatural, definitely not. Without asking, well, why would that be the case? So Robert Funk says this: the notion that God interferes with the order of nature is no longer credible. Miracles contradict the regularity of the order of the physical universe. God does not interfere with the laws of nature. The resurrection of Jesus did not involve the resurrection of a corpse. Jesus did not rise from the dead, except perhaps in some metaphorical, mythological sense. By the way, this came out a couple of decades ago, but still relevant here too. A guy by the name of, Thomas Jefferson, he actually went one step further. This is actually, Thomas Jefferson's Bible is actually in the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. What Thomas Jefferson did is he went through his Bible with a razor blade and he cut out anything supernatural. He condensed the New Testament into 84 pages. By the way some people preach, I think that's actually pretty accurate. But he basically kind of cut it all down and said, you know what? If it's miraculous or supernatural, it's not true. He kind of condensed it down. So the reality is this. When we talk about the supernatural, when we talk about this idea about it, we get kind of uncomfortable. Kind of going, well, okay. C.S. Lewis says it this way in his book Miracles, by the way. Fantastic book to read. A naturalistic Christianity leaves out all that is specifically Christian. So here's a fun fact. If you think about this idea about the miraculous or the supernatural, if it bothers you, if it makes you uncomfortable, realize something. Everything about your faith is supernatural. Salvation is supernatural. What God did, continues to do, is supernatural. And if you try to extrapolate that, if you try to extract that from our faith, you don't really have anything there. And again, Thomas Jefferson, when he's talking about it, he said, I just want a moral code. And again, I appreciate his recognizing that the Bible is an excellent moral code. However, that's not all it is to it, though. When we talk about the Bible, and we're going to talk about the Bible history today, the Bible is the account of real people living in real places, interacting with other real cultures. The sciences of archaeology, anthropology, and history are all part of the disciplines used to understand and interpret these accounts. Now, this is important here, because when we talk about science in the Bible, people go, well, it's not, you can't, those two don't go together. However, most universities have an archaeology department. Most have one on that history department. Most have one on anthropology as well too. And these disciplines actually apply to the Bible. One of the reasons why I came back to Christianity is I actually studied, like the Quran, for example, the Book of Mormon, right? The Vedas. I want to say, okay, these are the documents that these other people believe to be true. Before I can say, whether Allah or the Mormon God or, the Hindu pantheon of gods, before I can acknowledge that to be true, I need to examine first the documents that claim that. And that was actually one of the turning points for me, is because when you dive deep into the history, just so you know, I love history. I'm a huge history buff, right? But I'm not a history buff in the sense of like, hey, you say it's to be true, I got to research. Fun fact about me, I can't buy anything without researching it, right? Amazon reviews, I go through all of them, and I actually even go, okay, apart from Amazon, what do other people say about this product? I can't buy anything without researching. I don't know why. It's a sickness. My wife thinks it's stupid, but I can't. But I'm right, okay? Because you just can't buy stuff. You gotta make sure it's okay, right? Likewise, when I talk about another religious document, the Quran, for example, is this actually true? Did these things happen to these people in these places? Because as soon as you say Israel, Babylon, Egypt, these are not mythological names. These are people and people groups that we know and we have lots of information on. And so does the Bible actually kind of glide into it, or is it actually, no, 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 the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Mesopotamians, all that, there's no mention of the Jewish people at all. Then you go, that's not good. So does history actually bring us to that? So I opened my big mouth and I talked about Jonah. I said to you that you have to look at the book of Jonah as being historical. And I know for most people are like, no, 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 no. We can't look at the book of Jonah as that. So I thought I'd use the book of Jonah as a way of showing you that there is a lot of historical information in the book of Jonah that actually proves to be correct. Now, quick note. When we look at the book of Jonah, everybody gets stuck on the whale. Fun fact, there was no whale in the book of Jonah. We'll get to that in a second. But the point is this, is they overlook everything else that's going on in the book of Jonah. They go, well, there is no whale that could swallow Jonah. Well, like, that's just crazy. I said, okay, if you want to take the whale out, what about everything else? Do you think God can command nature? Do you think God can speak to somebody? Do you think God could command a plant to grow like pretty much fast? And then could God command or arrange, as the Bible says, for a worm or something to chew that plant to die? Do you think that the city of Toronto could in one day decide to become followers of Yahweh? Or LA, pick a large city. And I'm going to show you why in a second, why I'm using those analogies. So when people talk about Jonah, they get stuck on the whale, but they don't realize that the entire book is full of supernatural stuff. And they just overlook it. Jonah chapter 1, verse 1. The Lord gave this message to Jonah, son of Amittai. Now, does that mean that God can speak? Yes or no? So if you're saying you don't want to fish, but you acknowledge this, we got a bit of a problem here because you are now living in a bit of a contradiction. Jonah chapter 1, verse 4. But the Lord hurled a powerful wind over the sea. Wait, so you're telling me that God can control nature, but you're stuck on the fish? Fair enough, okay. Casting lots. These people cast lots to figure out who's. Could you imagine being around? Okay, so we know that this wind came out of nowhere, and one of you messed up. So we're gonna draw straws to see who it is, and it falls on Jonah, right? The sailors were awestruck by the Lord's great power. The Lord spoke. People of Nineveh believed. Lord arranged for a leafy plant to grow. God also arranged for a worm. The point is this. When we talk about the book of Jonah, everyone gets stuck on the whale. And don't worry, I'm going to get to the whale or the fish or the being or whatever it was. We'll get to that in a second. But let's take a look at everything else in the book of Jonah. Did you know that up until the late 1800s, everybody didn't believe that Nineveh actually existed? So most historians, when they read the book of Jonah, it wasn't the whale, but that was part of it. But they said there's no historical mention of this place called Nineveh. And the way the Bible describes Nineveh, it's a large city. As a matter of fact, according to archaeological digs, now it was the largest city in the world at that time. What does the book of Jonah tells us? It takes 3 days to walk through the city. Hi, Toronto called. So historians would say, well, by the way, not only is this whale swallowing Jonah thing kind of preposterous, but also, too, this place, Nineveh, we have no proof. Until the city of Nineveh was rediscovered after more than 2,500 years of obscurity. It is now believed to have been the largest city in the world at the time of its demise. According to Sir Austin Henry Layard, who chronicled the discovery of Nineveh, the circumference of the Greater Nineveh was exactly 3 days' journey, as recorded in Jonah chapter 3, verse 3. Prior to its rediscovery, skeptics scoffed at the possibility that so large a city could have existed in the ancient world. In fact, some skeptics denied the existence of Nineveh altogether. Its rediscovery in the mid-1800s proved to be a remarkable vindication for the Bible, which mentions Nineveh by name 18 times and dedicates 2 entire books, Jonah and Nahum, to its fate. Here's a little fun fact for you as well, too. It's interesting to note that when the lost city of Nineveh was rediscovered, it was found buried beneath a pair of towers. These are like pillars, okay? In the vicinity of Mosul in modern-day Iraq. These mounds are known by their local names. I'm not going to pronounce them. Nabu Yunus happens to be the Arabic name for who? The prophet Jonah. Could you imagine finding the Nineveh, which you didn't think existed, and on the very top of that, inscribed in it, is this guy's name? A little freaky, right? A little freaky. Oh, okay, all right. Well, let's go on. Jonah's account also exhibits another certain geographical tidbit, which Craig Davis points out in his book, Dating the Old Testament. Jonah left Nineveh and watched it from the east. Remember, I told you that whenever the Bible adds a detail, it's always there for a reason. It's always there for a reason. It could have said, and Jonah just sat on a hill to watch Nineveh burn. They do not. They say Jonah goes to the east. Now, why would he go to the east? Nineveh was located on the east bank of the Tigris River, with hills east of the city. This would give Jonah a good vantage point to view the city. This matches the Bible description, Jonah chapter 4, verse 5. Okay, interesting. Now, there's something else as well, too. There's something called the Assyrian lists. I'm going to unpack this for you. We have these ancient documents called Assyrian lists, and what they do is they chronologically look at year by year of these cities, right? And what they say is that on this year we conquered this, right? Remember, the reasons why Jonah hated Nineveh so much is the Assyrians were the first culture to have a full-time standing army, okay? And the army was brutal. Like when they would go into a place, they would kill everyone. Indiscriminately, they would just kill everybody. So the Assyrians were very much feared. Nineveh was a capital of the Assyrian Empire. And these lists show year by year everything that takes place. So it doesn't just start off like in the time of its destruction, but it goes back into antiquity as well too. Now, why am I telling you this? Because we have a reference in this back to Shalmaneser IV, the first king of the 8th century period of stagnation. A military campaign took place every single year throughout his reign and continued to the reign of the following king, Ashur-dan III. His first three eponymous documents, foreign military engagements, but notice the recording on his fourth year of the rule. During the eponemy of Apela, the government Mazuma, the king stayed in the land. So the first time in the entire recorded history of the Assyrian Empire, let's just take a break of killing other people. Just so you know, it's odd. I've said this before, that whenever I see a word used in the Bible that's never used anywhere else, whenever I see something happen in the Bible that doesn't happen anywhere else, I take note. There's a reason it's there. Likewise, when historians see some kind of change in behavior, they go, I wonder what that could be. This is remarkable. Every prior year, for 41 years, without fail, Assyria's leader had engaged in a material campaign, but not this year. Now, here's something else as well, too. In the 3rd century BC, a Babylonian priest, historian named Berosus, wrote of a mythical creature named Oannes, who, according to Berosus, emerged from the sea to give divine wisdom to men. Scholars generally identify this mysterious fish man as an avatar of the Babylonian water god Ea, also known as Enki. The curious thing about Berosus' account is the name he uses, Oannes. Berosus wrote in Greek during the Hellenistic period. Oannes is just a single letter removed from the Greek name Ionis, which happens to be used in the Greek New Testament for, you guessed it, Jonah. As for the I being dropped from Oannes, Professor Turnbull writes, in the Assyrian description of the J of the foreign words becomes I or disappears altogether. Hence, Joannes, as a Greek representative of Jonah, would appear in the Syrian either as Oannes or Onus. I had to double check this because I wasn't sure if this would be true. I found another reference to it as well too. Berosus claimed to have relied upon official Babylonian sources for his information. Nineveh was conquered by the Babylonians under King Nabopolassar in 612 BC, more than 300 years before Berosus. It is quite conceivable that the record of Jonah's success in Nineveh was preserved in the writings available to Berosus. If so, it appears that Jonah was deified and mythologized, which makes total sense, over a period of 3 centuries. First by the Assyrians, who no doubt associated him with their fish god Dagon, and then by the Babylonians, who appear to have hybridized him with their own water god Ea. Because remember, fish guy emerges from the sea, preaches. By the way, in the Hebrew, his sermon, I know you're about to get jealous, is only 5 words. 5 words. That's how much Jonah hated Nineveh. He's like, fine, Lord, I'll use 5 words. And you're like, Pastor, take a note from Jonah, right? He used 5 words, walked up and down 3 days, and the only thing he said was the 5 words. And those 5 words were enough to get the greatest city in the world and their animals, you read the account, to become Yahweh followers. So you would think that there would be some sort of record. Fish guy comes in and tells us a sermon, and everybody repents. From the king to the lowest to the animals. Now, please understand, I don't know how animals can become saved. Please don't understand that. I like to believe that every chicken wing that I eat, the animal was saved before I ate it. So I'm going to go with that. But I don't know if that would be true or not. Now, let's talk about the fish, because this is the part that you think is most uncomfortable. Now, the Lord had arranged for a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was inside the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Now, just so you know, in chapter 2, verse 5, there's an interesting note. I sank beneath the waters, beneath the waves. This is Jonah, his prayer from inside whatever it is there. And the waters closed over me. Now, this is an interesting point here. Seaweed wrapped itself around my head. Why would Jonah put that little detail in there? It's kind of interesting, actually, if you think about it, because if you think to yourself, well, it's Jonah, it's VeggieTales, he's in the whale, or is Pinocchio in the whale, whatever it might be, why does seaweed get in there? It's a bit of an odd kind of a thing to put in there, but there's also kind of an interesting point to it, and I'll tell you why in a second. Also, there's one fact I left out because I can't quite explain. Jonah says that the beast took him to the mountains under the earth. How does the ancient world know that what we know, that the typography of the ocean floor is not flat? It's just like it was on the actual outside. So when he used the word mountains in the ocean, we go, now the reason I haven't mentioned it, I don't know how to explain it. Like, I don't think the fish had a window, but somehow he knew. So I'm only gonna explain to you what I can explain. And the rest, I'm going to have to go, I don't know how he knew that there were mountains underneath the sea. Because remember, for the ancient people, 10 feet under the water, that's it. That's as far as we go. How far can you go? As far as I can hold my breath. Well, I'm telling you right now, you're not going to find mountains at that level. You're going to see deep, dark, but that's all you're going to see. But Jonah mentions that in his prayer. How does he know that? I have no idea. None whatsoever, but I'm throwing it out there. Okay, so now let's talk about this fish, or whale, or whatever it is. As for the whale or great fish that swallowed Jonah, the Bible doesn't specify what sort of marine animal it was. The Hebrew phrase used in the Old Testament, gadol dag, literally means great fish. Pause. When people say whale, they're extrapolating. And actually, this comes from the 3rd century from a commentator on that. And it was changed to whale at that point in time. In some of your Bibles, it will say whale. But that's not what the Hebrew word says. It says great fish. Now, please, in the ancient world, it could be a whale or it could be something else. It doesn't matter. It's big enough that a human being can fit in its mouth. By the way, there's quite a few of those. I saw the movie Jaws. Terrified me as a kid. I could fit in that thing's mouth. Don't want to, but I could. And there's much more than that as well, too. The Greek used in the New Testament is katos, which simply means sea creature. There are at least 2 species in the Mediterranean marine life that are able to swallow a man whole. These are the cachalot, also known as the sperm whale, and the white shark. Both creatures are known to prowl the Mediterranean, have been known to sailors since antiquity. Aristotle described both species in his 4th century BC Historia Animalium. Now, here's a point. These creatures were around during the time of Jonah. But there's also another creature, which we'll get to in a second, is also present there as well, too. Now, the word belly is a fairly vague term in English, let alone in ancient Hebrew. So if Jonah was swallowed by a creature such as a sperm whale, he might have been in the great Laryngeian pouch. So it could be here, but they would use the term belly to describe that. So if I said to you, it's in my belly, it could be in my esophagus or my mouth, but it's going to make its way there eventually. So when we use the word belly, we need to understand that. Remember I told you a couple weeks ago that the ancient Hebrew language only had about 7,000 words. So when they talk about how they describe things, they're using the language they have to them to be able to describe that. Now, let me give you what I think is the best hypothesis to this individual. And this comes, by the way, what I'm going to present to you is only the things I could verify. There's other stories. One story of a guy named Bartlett who was swallowed by a sperm whale, but guess what? Couldn't verify it. It was folklore, so I'm not going to present it to you. But I'm telling you about it, and I'm telling you I opted not to talk about it because I couldn't get any data to actually believe it. Now, Dr. Harry Reimer, I'm going to explain to you who this guy is in a second, tells of personally meeting a sailor who fell overboard from a trawler in the English Channel and was swallowed by a gigantic Rhizodon or whale shark. The entire trawler fleet set out to hunt down the shark down, and 48 hours after the incident, the shark was sighted and slain with a 1-pound deck gun. The carcass was too heavy for the ship's winches to handle, so the crew towed it to shore, intending to give their friend a Christian burial. When the shark was opened, the man was found unconscious but alive. He was rushed to the hospital where he was found to be suffering from shock alone and was later discharged. He was on exhibit in a London museum at a shilling admission, and he was advertised as Jonah of the 20th century. Now, let me tell you who Dr. Harry Reimer is. He was the president of Research Science Bureau of LA. Not a Christian, not a pastor. Please understand, I don't tend to believe other Christians as well too. It makes me a little bit weird that way. If a Christian says something, I'm still gonna fact check this. Okay? So the fact that I found multiple sources to kind of confirm this made me go, oh, okay. Said that he found an account of an English sailor swallowed by a giant Rhyodon in the English Channel in the Library Digest. Apparently, they were trying to harpoon the giant sharks when the sailor fell overboard. Before he could be pulled back in the boat, the shark turned around and swallowed him up. 48 hours after the incident, the shark was found and killed. When the shark was opened by the sailors, they were amazed to find their friend alive and unconscious. They rushed him to the hospital where they found that he had only suffered from shock. He was perfectly healthy and fit and otherwise. In 1926, Dr. Reimer met the man and said his body was devoid of hair and patches of yellowish-brown color covered his entire skin. Now, this is in keeping with what we know of the digestive system of a whale shark. Now, for those of you who are divers, and probably only Randy's going to know this, there's something called a Divers Alert Network. The Divers Alert Network put this alert out a couple of years ago. I want to share it with you. During the dive, the largest whale shark, so a group of people decide, hey, it'd be fun to dive with whale sharks. I don't know if that's a fun thing, but they did that. And the area began to act differently. It appeared to be swimming directly at divers with its mouth wide open. As we would get close, the shark would open its mouth, but multiple divers were able to swim out of its path. After being in the water for 40 minutes, the diver was attempting to photograph this interaction of the whale shark and the other divers when the whale shark turned suddenly towards her. The diver recalls being hit hard by the whale shark. Then the diver was sucked into the mouth of the whale shark head first and half swallowed up to her thighs. The diver struggled to escape the whale shark's mouth for a brief moment before the shark spat the diver out and forcefully spinning her about in the water. She then swam over to the dive guides. Upon assessment, the diver had minor abrasions in the back of her head. This comes from the Divers Alert Network, which is, by the way, a nonprofit organization. I put the logo down the bottom there because if you've ever gone to diving manuals, you'll see this logo. Now, why am I telling you this? When we talk about this idea of a creature holding on to Jonah, that woman who almost got swallowed there, what we recognize is that I believe, according to the data, he wasn't swallowed but held in the mouth of this creature. That's the reason why water poured over him, and the other reason why seaweed wrapped around his head. Is because the writer was trying to tell us something without telling us something. He's trying to tell us that whatever he was still exposed to the ocean. Now, imagine for a moment that a whale shark grabs a hold of you. I researched this one as well, too. There'd be a pocket of air at the top of its mouth because it's not going to suck in all of it. It's not going to fill it right to the top. So imagine for a moment you're in the first part of it. Now, whale sharks don't eat people. They eat krill, so they're filtration, right? So Jonah's not going to have to worry about being crunched to death. But imagine being stuck in this thing. It opens its mouth, brings in water, krill to filter it through. There's a pocket of air. Where are you going to go? To the top, because you're going to float to the top, right? You're going to suck on that air as much as possible until the thing opens its mouth again for more air. Now, why am I telling you this? Because the Bible tends to think of Jonah as actually being a historical document. Now, not only does 2 Kings recognize who Jonah is, so Jonah isn't just this character that kind of appears as a mythology or folklore, but he's actually recognized and acknowledged who he is. We see this in 2 Kings chapter 14, verse 25. Likewise, Jesus, you know that guy, he talks about Jonah as if it's actually a thing, as opposed to a metaphor. Luke chapter 11, verse 29 to 30. And he talks about this because what's important to Jesus is not the whale or the fish or whatever, but it's the people of Nineveh. Because I have said before, and I'll say it again, the greatest miracle in the book of Jonah is not the fish, it's the people. I can't imagine Toronto, LA, Manhattan, Paris, London. You pick the big city, everybody there decided to become a follower of Yahweh. That is incredible to me. That's the greatest miracle of the book of Jonah. Everyone gets hung up on this sea creature. Now, let's talk about this whole thing. I said to you before that when we look at the book of Jonah, we see that there is more supernatural going on than just a fish. So the acknowledgement is either A, you believe that the supernatural is possible, or B, you do not. If you do not, you become like Thomas Jefferson, you become like Robert Funk, you become like a host of other Christians, which we'll talk about next week, who have decided that the Bible is a good document for moral truth, except for the stuff where people do really bad things. And then that's about it. And I get that, right? It's an a priori, it's a acknowledgement right beforehand saying there's no supernatural, therefore. But if you say that, then your aliens and your ghosts and all that got to go out the window as well too. However, if you believe that there is something called the supernatural, then the person who controls that, well, it's not too far of a stretch for him to be able to use the natural. Remember, the phrase supernatural just means an acceleration of the natural. So when Jesus healed somebody, he brought their body back to the state it was intended. He didn't give them a third arm. He didn't make them like be able to lift super strength or become like the Flash, like one of the mutants or the X-Men. He just did what was natural, whether it's disease, whether it's death, and he accelerated the healing or brought back. This is not in the realm of mythology. And by the way, if you study mythology, if you study these fairy tales, the claims that are made within it are huge. They're not just in the natural. They are like way out there. Tolkien, yes, wrote The Lord of the Rings. That's what he did. He studied myths. He studied all these folklores. But when he looked at the Bible, he didn't see any of that language in there. That's one of the reasons why Tolkien became a Christ follower. That's why he was friends with C.S. Lewis and created this group of writers. By the way, if I could go back in time machine, I'd like to be part of these writers. They call themselves the Inklings. Because both Tolkien and Lewis, very, very smart individuals, saw the Bible and didn't see mythology in it. Saw actual history. Now, let's talk about history here for a second. I'm going to give you some examples here. One of the things I always hear people say, well, the Bible's myth, fair enough. People say, well, it didn't exist, fair enough. But when people say that, we as Christians kind of go, well, okay, maybe you're right, I don't know. I, however, have a different way of doing it. I always say, prove it. Now, it seems kind of an odd thing to say, but they're making a statement that they're expecting you to prove, but you could invert that statement and say, well, prove to me that the Bible isn't true. Wow. No, that's not an answer. The answer is, show me something that can prove the Bible to be untrue. So let me give you a couple of examples. Maybe you want to tuck these in your back pocket in case you're having a conversation with a difficult person, or you see something on social media. What's interesting about the Bible, as I said to you before, it's real people in real time, real places interacting with real cultures. Surely there has to be a mention of Israel or some of these kings and other cultures. Why? They're at war. They're fighting. They're neighbors. There's peace treaties. There's got to be some record, as opposed to just some guy writing this Bible in the backyard of his house there and saying, hey, here's a Bible. So one of the first ones to come across is this one here. It's called the Tel Dan, and it's called a Tel Dan inscription. The Tel Dan inscription is a fragment of another stele made in the 9th century BCE by Aramean king Hazael. Boasting of his victory against the Israelites, the stele mentions the king of Judah as being from the house of David. This is one of the first recognitions we have that A, Jewish people existed at this time period and they were at war, but B, David himself was a king, house of David. This is, by the way, huge, because until we found this is a number of decades ago, we had no mention of David. And so David was seen as a mythological king for Israel, as an archetype. This is what a good king looks like, right? It's kind of like King Arthur, right? King David, King Arthur, same family tree. Until we came across this, and we go, oh, by the way, it was funny. I was going to do this top 10 archaeological finds to prove the Bible. Do you know what I found out? You can't do that. You know why? It's by year. Top 10 archaeological finds for 2023, 2022, 2021. So I went through and I sifted through them. You're welcome. But I went through and found what I thought were the best ones. But the reason why they go by year, because every year they're discovering more that verifies the history of the Bible, which is kind of interesting if you think about it, if the Bible is mythology. Here's another one. Often missed by the visitors to the Israel Museum, the Ekron description was found in the 1990s in the foundations of a Philistine temple at the biblical Ekron. Now, what's interesting about this is these Philistines are mentioned in the Bible, but they don't have a lot of historical references to them. So people go, well, the writers of the Bible created these Philistines as basically kind of the big baddies that the Israelites could beat up on, but they didn't actually exist because we don't have any proof of that until, right? By the way, that's kind of the most common things you hear when people talking about the history of the Bible. We have no proof until we actually find it. So we see this here, and what's amazing about this is that the Ekron description is also talks about the Philistines' history, but also they adopted the Hebrew language as their own language. It's kind of a fun fact. Something else here too. Sometimes hailed as the first declaration of human rights, a copy of it resides in the headquarters of the United Nations. You know, that small, obscure organization nobody's heard about. More to the point of this blog, the Cyrus Cylinder confirms a biblical claim that Cyrus allowed the Jewish people who had been captured by the Babylonians to return to their homeland and rebuild the temple. By the way, this is kind of huge, because not only is it talking about what happened in the book of Ezra, but it's actually showing us historical proof that this actually took place. Right? And so, again, the reason I like this one here, because again, it's in the United Nations. By the way, this cylinder here, I'm not going to talk about it now, but also proves the prophecies of the book of Daniel. Fun fact, the book of Daniel talks about Alexander the Great 400 years before the guy exists. And not just in kind of metaphor like, oh, there's this guy. No. It talks about his how he conquers and also how he dies and how his empire be broke up into 4 parts, which, by the way, is kind of specific. And then that's exactly what happens to Alexander the Great. And by the way, that's verified in this tablet, but I'm not going to go into that. But the important part is, though, is this verifies a key piece of Israel's history of returning back to Israel, and is recorded not by Jewish, but by somebody else. Another one. The Hebrew records that throughout their history, the Israelites and Egyptians had significant interactions on numerous occasions. But is there any evidence from the Egyptian side? This is kind of important. Someone said to me, oh, there's no evidence that, the Israelites were slaves in Egypt or they actually left Egypt. I'm like, oh, do tell. Right? See, here's the thing. A lot of these arguments are based upon your ignorance, my ignorance. And what I mean by that is that all you got to do is a little bit of a study and you realize, oh, none of these claims actually hold up. The historicity of the scriptures is actually almost unimpeachable in the sense of what's there. Now, please understand something. I'm not saying to you that these historical archaeological finds tell us that God is real. I need to be very clear on that. The reason I'm trying to be very clear on that, I'm not making suppositions that don't actually exist. What I am trying to tell you, though, is when the Bible talks about these people in these times, in these places, it's not mythology. It's not like, hey, just believe it by faith. See, this is what drove me away from the church, is when I ask questions, people say, you just got to believe by faith. Yes, but not this part. See, the part that I need to believe in faith is the leap towards who God is. Not about what his people did and all that. I just wish somebody would have told me, by the way, the Bible isn't just myth or whatever, because that's what I thought. That it's historically verifiable. One more. The Kirk monolith, uncovered by Tel Kirk in Syria in the 19th century, is one of the earliest mentions of ancient Israel, predating both the Tel Dan, we talked about that in inscription, and the Mesha stele, we just talked about a second ago, by several decades. The monolith, technically a stele, was erected by Shalmaneser III, the king of Assyria, to commemorate his military campaign in the west in 853 BCE. Although important for reconstructing Shalmaneser's reign, the stele is also interesting for the mention of who? Ahab, king of Israel. By the way, that should seem familiar to you. Why? It's in the king's list. So we have a representation of a king mentioned in the Bible by another culture. And again, in their own way of talking about this. Historian named John Elder says this: it is not too much to say that it was the rise of science of archaeology, by the way, I love that phrase, that broke the deadlock between historians and Orthodox Christian. Little by little, one city after another, one civilization after another, one culture after another, whose memories were enshrined only in the Bible, were restored to their proper place in ancient history by the study of archaeologists. The overall result is indisputable. Forgotten cities have been found, the handiwork of vanished peoples have reappeared, contemporary records of biblical events have been unearthed, and uniqueness of biblical revelation has been emphasized by contrast and comparison to the newly understood religions of ancient peoples. Nowhere has archaeological discovery refuted the Bible as history. By the way, if you don't remember anything this morning, please remember that last sentence. When people talk about science of the Bible, they talk about that. I love archaeology. I actually thought at one point in time I'd be an archaeologist because I loved history so much. And by the way, Egypt was my jam, right? To go to the pyramids and all that, that was like, whew, that'd be amazing. One day, hopefully I get there. But the point is this. The reason why I was brought back into faith is because I started looking at the Bible not as just a religious document, not a serial list of, hey, this is how you be a good person. There are real people interacting with real culture. And all the rules of anthropology, archaeology, history were applied to it. And guess what? The Bible, time and time again. By the way, this is the Old Testament. I haven't gotten to New Testament yet. I'm not going to. Because New Testament's easy. Old Testament's a little bit more difficult. Let's go back to C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis in the book Miracles says this: one is very often asked at present whether we could not have a Christianity stripped, or as people who ask it to say, freed from its miraculous elements. A Christianity without the miraculous elements suppressed. Now, it seems to me that precisely the one religion in the world, or at least the only one I know, with which you could not do this, is Christianity. Lewis's definition of supernatural: an interference with nature by supernatural power. Many people think one can decide whether a miracle occurred in the past by examining the evidence according to the ordinary rules of historical inquiry. But the ordinary rules cannot be worked until we have decided whether miracles are possible, and if so, how probable they are. And that's it right there. If someone says to me, I don't believe anything miraculous, believe it or not, I'm okay with that statement. The reason I'm okay with that statement is they're at least acknowledging that. And if they say, well, that's why I don't like the Bible, fair enough. But again, I will push on that a little bit by saying, where do you get that information from? Again, by the way, saying there's no supernatural is an act of faith. As long as you're okay saying that, I'm okay too, because I can say I believe the supernatural as an act of faith. By the way, I have more data to support my claim than yours, but that's a different conversation. Let me close again. Let me close with the scripture we started off with. Psalm 78. I will teach you hidden lessons from our past. The reason I love this so much is when I imagine the psalmist sitting down with his children or his grandchildren and talking about Yahweh. And he's not weaving myth. He's not like, hey kids, let me tell you a story of a unicorn that came from the rainbow across the sky. And on the unicorn's back was this mighty warrior sheathed in gold and all that. That's myth. Instead, he would say, let me tell you about King David. Let me tell you about Abraham. Let me tell you about Moses. And that's like, these are real people. See, you don't create faith by talking about myth. You create faith by talking about facts. And then you go, oh. And again, as I said to you before, I'm not saying to you that just understanding the historical evidence is going to prove to you that God exists. What it is going to say to me, that the Bible is at least trustworthy in this regards. And then from there, I get to make a decision. So as Christians, we can say to ourselves, is the Bible true? We've talked about that. I've used that phrase a few times now. And the question isn't, is the Bible true? The question is, what will you do with this truth? Because the Bible is true. And not just true as like, oh, it's so true for me. It is true for me. But every rule that I can think of, we apply to everything else, we apply to the Bible, and it is still true. So then the uncomfortable question is what Kierkegaard says when he talks about the Bible. We Christians are scoundrels. We know what the Bible says, but we try to pretend it doesn't say that so we don't have to live it. And that's where the world comes into it as well. If they can say the Bible isn't true, then they don't have to live by how the Bible views and frames the world. And again, please hear me very clearly. I'm okay with someone saying I don't believe in the Bible. But I also want to make sure that person says that claim is an act of faith, not an act of science. Because when they start making those claims, then we have a different conversation altogether. Is the Bible true? Yes, but in so many different levels. The history of the Bible, the archaeology of the Bible, the anthropology. I didn't even get into anthropology a lot, but there's so many ways we can look at this and going, when Israel was at this time, did they actually have these metals, these animals, these creatures that they talk about? One of the reasons why the Book of Mormon is so comical to me is when Joseph Smith was writing it, he didn't know anything about history. So he talks about the Mesopotamian area. He talks about Latin America. He says all these cities, all these people, these metals and these technology. And he places it in a time period which historians go, you're like 2,000 years off. We talk about the Quran. There's a reason why the Quran is seen as a religious document, it's not historical. Because there's no serious historian that looks at it today and goes, well, no, it's actually true. As a matter of fact, there's a guy named Jay Smith. If you're ever looking for more information on this, his name is Jay Smith. He's got a YouTube channel called Fander Films, Pfander Films. He is the foremost expert on the historicity of the Quran. He has all these videos. He's the guy that I decided to go to for this. I don't want to go into it. He's the guy you go to. His stuff, by the way, Jay Smith is the only guy in the world to this date who has debated and beat all the Muslim apologists, all the foremost Muslim apologists. He's the only guy. Now, what he's doing today is kind of interesting. He's actually teaching other people all these things he's learned, all these archaeological digs, all these historical facts, so they can do the same thing he does, which, by the way, is kind of cool. Can you trust the Bible? Yes. Now, what you do with that trust, that's up to you. Is God who he says he is? I believe so. Was Jonah swallowed, held by a sea creature? I absolutely 100% believe that. No metaphor. It's not even me like, well, no, it's true. Everything else about the book of Jonah is true. The historicity of it, the city of Nineveh, the size of it, 3 days journey. By the way, it's a very specific detail. The east of it, all of that says true. So why would I not believe this piece? Is it because of my discomfort with the supernatural? That's a me problem then, not the Bible problem. You can trust the Bible. You don't have to be uncomfortable with the claims of the Bible. You don't have to know everything, but I just want you to know something. Apart from everything else I said, I know there's lots of information this morning. Believe the Bible to be true. Place your trust in the words of it and who it talks about, Yahweh, Jesus, our Creator. All these things are true, and we can have hope and faith in that. Let's pray. Heads are bowed, eyes are closed. You guys know what we're going to do. Maybe this morning you're the person who's been wrestling with these truths. Maybe you've seen something, heard something, people say something, and you're like, well, can I trust the Bible? Can I place my faith in this ancient document? And I think the answer you're hearing me this morning is abso-freaking-lutely. There's much I don't understand about the Bible. There's much I don't understand about this world and how God operates. And I just want to confess that to you. I don't want to oversimplify God. I don't want to oversimplify faith. But what I do want to do is tell you where your hope can be found. The Bible has been preserved for us. It's accurate. It's true. In every level of every way that we could apply to this ancient document. That alone should tell us something about how serious God is about his interaction with us, but also what we need to do with our faith. So if you've been here this morning and you've been wrestling with these questions, you've been asking, well, I don't know, please hear me very clearly. You can trust the Bible. You can trust what it says. You then have to then decide what you want to do with that. Dear Lord Jesus, I thank you. I thank you that your word is true, and not just true in a this feels really good in my heart true, but it's true in every sense, that both my head and my heart can both read these words and be transformed. Lord, I pray for each person here this morning. In Jesus' name, I pray, Holy Spirit, that we would have an excitement, a passion once again for your word. The Bible is the only document on this planet that has you guiding it, that has you infusing its words with your Holy Spirit, which brings fresh revelation, fresh truth to our lives. Lord, please forgive us if we think we know everything. Please forgive us when our devotions seem so boring and stale because we just view these words as just simply words. The Bible is the account of real people interacting with God with some amazing results and some horrible, horrible consequences. And Lord, when I read the Bible, I don't just read these words, but I see myself in this story. I see myself aligned with people good and bad. And I realize, Lord, this is for my instruction, but it's also for my revelation of who you are. Holy Spirit, make us passionate again for your word. Make us joyous about reading these words and realizing that they're so precious and kept and preserved by you, by your Spirit. I ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.